Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much. Thanks for being so patient, and thank you all so much for attending my doctoral defense. Today, I'll be talking about my PhD work here towards the next generation of GPS signals, how we redesign new codes and ensure navigation security. So currently, we have billions of users of GPS. GPS is used in transportation, but this is actually just one sector of users. GPS is also used in our emergency services to locate victims, in our farming sector, as well as in our financial sector for precise timing of financial transactions, our energy sector, and our communications globally. So GPS is woven into the fabric of modern civilization, underlying nearly every aspect of how society functions today. But despite its current importance, if we look over the course of the history of GPS, since its first satellite was launched in 1978, while there has been continuous advancement with new satellite buses and new signals being developed, all four of which are still used today. But despite this continuous improvement, the current GPS signals lack authentication, meaning that an attacker can mimic your GPS signal and spoof your location and timing. And in fact, a few years ago, a report was published for the first time documenting real-world indisputable spoofing cases and nearly 10,000 such cases in the Black Sea area. The current signals are also fixed, meaning that they can't be significantly updated once a satellite is launched. And the current signals use codes that were designed prior to the recent boom in computing. However, we're now about to embark in a new era of GPS navigation. Later this year, the navigation technology satellite NTS-3 will be launched to test new signals for the future generations of GPS, including the first signal with authentication, called Chimera. Additionally, starting in 2026, the GPS 3F satellites will be the first to have a fully reprogrammable signal payload, allowing for the opportunity to re-explore the signal design, including the design of the GPS codes. So in this respect, this thesis focuses on two main objectives: ensuring security with Chimera and leveraging the ability to reprogram the signals in order to redesign the GPS codes. Now, with regards to Chimera, this enhancement embeds digital watermarks within the GPS signal, and there are two sets of these watermarks, the fast and the slow. However, before a user can validate these watermarks and trust their GPS source, they have to wait for the corresponding key. So either the fast key once every 6 seconds or the slow key once every 3 minutes. But even for the fast channel, users typically rely on much faster GPS update rates from between 6 and 120 measurements within the same time frame. As a result, while Chimera allows us to validate our GPS source, this service isn't continuously available. So we need a GPS verification and navigation solution for between these Chimera authentication times. And users often already have an additional sensor on board, like an IMU or a wheel encoder. And this can help us bridge this Chimera epoch between the Chimera authentications with a conservative state estimate. However, this state estimate is often less accurate than continuously using GPS. And while prior works have looked at checking the consistency of this state with the received measurements in order to decide how much to trust GPS, these self-contained sensors can have unmodeled biases and imperfect calibration that should be accounted for. So in this respect, we want to develop a solution for between Chimera authentications, which allows us to leverage the existing sensors to continuously authenticate GPS in the presence of these sensing uncertainties. We also want to determine when GPS is trustworthy and when we can leverage it for navigation. And with regards to the GPS codes, these codes overlay the GPS signal to ensure precise ranging and reduced interference between the satellites. And the current codes are algorithmically generable sequences, meaning that they can be generated from a smaller number of bits using an algorithmic procedure. So for example, the GPS gold codes use two 10-bit shift registers to be generated, and the wheel codes can be generated from the Legendre sequence. Now, this was an important design consideration in the 70s when GPS was originally developed, when receiver memory was expensive and there was less computing power to search for better codes. However, today, memory is an inexpensive resource, both in terms of size and cost, and receivers are capable of storing complete sets of codes. And these are called memory codes, codes you have to directly store in memory. They're not algorithmically generable. And in fact, the European system Galileo, which began launches over 30 years after GPS, uses memory codes in their signals today. And there are several advantages to using memory codes. In particular, we have flexibility in the chosen code length and the family size or the number of codes. We can also optimize for any desired performance objective for the codes. It also gives us a greater range of possible codes as compared to algorithmically generable ones. However, with this greater range comes a key challenge in that the memory code design space is discrete and it's exponentially large. So we can't use exact optimization strategies for this purpose. So in this respect, we want to design a new framework for creating the GPS codes, which leverages stochastic optimization strategies to handle the discrete memory code design space, as well as the computational tools available to us today. And with respect to these two objectives, during the past 4 years of my PhD, I've had several publications, including these conference and journal papers with regards to the first objective on ensuring security with Chimera, as well as these entries for the second objective on redesigning the codes. And from this list, these publications are the ones for my thesis, and for today's talk, I'll talk about work from each of these 3 papers in particular. And correspondingly, the key contributions of this thesis are, first, we derive a continuous spoofing detector and state estimator for between Chimera authentications, which accounts for unmodeled sensing biases. And this will be the first part of today's talk. And second, we propose the first spoofing resilient filter for Chimera GPS, which leverages the unauthenticated GPS measurements when determined to be trustworthy. And finally, we design a new framework to devise memory codes for GPS, which have lower mean interference than the codes used today. And with that, for today's talk, I'll first begin with a bit of background on GPS and spoofing before presenting the first 2 parts. Then I'll get a bit of a background on the GPS codes before finishing with our memory code design framework. And then I'll summarize this work and discuss future directions before concluding with acknowledgements. So starting with a bit of background. For GPS, the user sees several satellites in view at the same time, and each satellite sends its location and the exact time that the signal was transmitted. Then when the receiver gets the signal from space, it records the precise time of reception. So from the time that the signal was sent and the time it was received, we can get a ranging measurement to the satellite, which can be used for trilateration, for positioning, as well as for timing corrections. Now, that's how it should ideally work if the received measurements are authentic and actually coming from the GPS satellites. But in the case of spoofing, an attacker can mimic these signals and vary the time of reception such that those measurements correspond to a different arbitrary location in order to trick the receiver. So with that, let's go into our first work on how we do continuous GPS authentication between the Chimera authentication times and with additional sensors on board. So past works for GPS consistency checking using additional sensors often assume perfect calibration. So that's zero mean Gaussian noise. And however, self-contained sensors and even GPS can contain unknown bias uncertainties. So for example, IMUs can have bias variations due to changes in temperature, and wheel encoders can have errors due to wheel slipping. And their errors can be characterized in terms of legal bias ranges, such as plus or minus 2% accuracy for its speedometers. Now, while spoofing detectors are designed to satisfy a false alarm threshold by modeling the authentic error and then the authentic error distribution and then defining bounds to throw an alarm, this same detector can, in the presence of unmodeled biases, exceed the false alarm requirement. So in this respect, we want a framework that can satisfy the false alarm requirement while accounting for these unmodeled biases. And for this, we use probabilistic zonotopes or p-zonotopes. So this is a mathematical framework which was originally used for formal verification in robotics. And in particular, this p-zonotopes don't just represent one distribution, they enclose a set of error probability distributions. For example, a set of Gaussians with an unknown but bounded mean. And we can extend this from the 1D case to 2 dimensions or even higher dimensions. And this represents regions of the space with high and low overbounding probabilities. So how do we use this for our framework? So going back to our problem statement, between the chimera authentication period, we received GPS, but it's not yet been authenticated. So zooming into this region here, we can model the vehicle state using different sources of information. So for example, the GPS measurements that we're getting, the previous chimera authenticated GPS with the self-contained sensor information, and then we can fuse these two as well, the current GPS and the sensor information. Now, while prior works would model the filter state and the measurement errors using Gaussian distributions, we rederive the state and error using probabilistic zonotope-based noise models. And we use a similar derivation as in our lab's prior work. So if we look at the GPS only and the trusted p-zonotopes, we would intuitively expect these to have significant overlap if the received GPS measurements are authentic. Otherwise, if we're being spoofed, we would expect to see inconsistencies and little overlap intuitively. However, we formally derive a probabilistic zonotope-based spoofing detector, which for this position estimate difference models a probabilistic overbound under authentic conditions while accounting for these bounded unmodeled biases. And then with this and the probability threshold, we can ensure that we satisfy the user-defined false alarm rate. And because we already have a model of the state and error, if our received GPS is authentic, we can use the tighter used p-zonotope for state estimation, and this is what our detector outputs. On the other hand, if we're being spoofed, the detector outputs the trusted p-zonotope until we can re-authenticate with Chimera. So going into our experimental results, we wanted to validate the probabilistic bounds that we derived for our detector. So we ran 1,000 Monte Carlo simulations for the 6-second Chimera authentication period. We also looked at our detector's false alarm rate and checked that it satisfies the required threshold of 3 thousandths, which corresponds to a 3 sigma confidence level. We look at the correct detection rate under spoofing conditions, and we look at the ratio of Monte Carlo runs where the true state is bounded by our detector's output p-zonotope. And then we compare this with the bounding properties of the fused p-zonotope for reference. We also model bounded biases for the GPS positioning measurements, as well as bounded propagation biases for 2 vehicle models. But for sake of time, we'll look at the double integrator system here. So first, for the authentic case, we can see in the corner here the true vehicle trajectory along with the trusted p-sonotope, the GPS only, and our detector's output p-sonotope. We also have here the ratio of false alarms output from our detector. This is over the 1,000 Monte Carlo runs and as a function of time over the 6-second trajectory. And we can see here that our detector's false alarms remain below the required threshold. We also have the ratio of Monte Carlo runs where our detector's output p-sonotope bounds the true vehicle state. And because the detector recognizes that the GPS is authentic, it outputs the fused p-sonotope. So both our detector sonotope and the fused p-sonotope bound the vehicle state over all Monte Carlo runs. Now, for the spoofing scenario, we can see here that the GPS trajectory deviates from the true trajectory. And the attack errors begin small at the beginning of the attack. But as the trajectory begins to deviate, our detector begins to recognize the attack, and the correct detection rate increases and reaches a final value of 1. And additionally, when the attack errors become large, the fused p-sonotope eventually fails to bound the true vehicle state. Whereas for our detector, because it recognizes the attack, it switches to using the trusted p-sonotope and continues to bound the vehicle state throughout the trajectory. Okay. So we just talked about how to do reliable and continuous GPS authentication. But for the state estimation part, can we do something better than just switching between the fused and the trusted state estimate? And can we more strategically decide when to leverage the unauthenticated GPS measurements? That's what we'll look into now. So to use or not to use GPS, at least between the Chimera authentications. So for the 3-minute slow channel, if we decide to go with the do not use GPS route and wait for authentication for those 3 minutes, we'll ensure security, but at the cost of degraded performance, with one IMU platform, IMU GPS platform studied by Professor Saiki's lab, observing over 300 meters of error. On the other hand, if we decide to use GPS right away without authentication, we'll forego security, but with the benefit of improved performance if we're not being spoofed, with significantly reduced errors. So we see this trade-off between security and performance, but what if instead of making this hard binary decision, we determine how much to rely on the GPS measurements to balance between these two objectives, improving real-time navigation performance while maintaining resilience against an experienced spoofing attack. So instead, we proposed this spoofing resilient filter framework with Chimera, where we first start with state propagation using the vehicle model and the self-contained sensor measurements. Then with the predicted state, we compare against the unauthenticated GPS measurements. And based on this measurement difference and the Chimera authentication once it's available, we assign a weight to the received GPS measurements, which represents their trustworthiness. So a weight of 0 means we discard the measurements, we don't use them. And a weight of 1 means we directly rely on GPS for corrections. Then with this weighted measurement, we update our vehicle state in an attack resilient manner. So going into more depth about this weighting scheme, for this, we use an extension of M-estimation. And M-estimation is a framework commonly used within the navigation community to downweigh the influence of outliers and extreme measurements. And traditionally, M-estimation assesses a scalar residual, or where a residual is a difference between the expected and received measurement. So for example, here, with respect to this estimate, this red measurement is significantly greater than we would expect. So we would downweigh this measurement correspondingly. However, a smart spoofer would be self-consistent with respect to the falsified GPS measurements. So we want to assign a single weight to all of the to the received GPS measurements overall. And in this respect, we extend estimation to assess a set of measurement residuals in order to determine the trustworthiness of our received GPS. Now, to give an illustrative example, here we have traditional estimation with 3 weight functions, the Huber, Hampel, and Tukey weight functions. And we see that these weight functions, in comparison to least squares, they downweigh larger residuals, since these are less likely to occur for nominal measurements. And correspondingly, for the scalar residual Ri, because this is larger than we would expect, these estimators might downweigh this measurement correspondingly. Now, to extend this, for our framework, we compare each of the received GPS measurements with our predicted state based on the self-contained sensor information. And from this, we get a residual vector. Now, to assess this residual vector, we first notice that these thresholds used by the estimators correspond to confidence levels. And then from this, we can rederive the estimators to be in terms of the CDF of the residual norm squared. And this is because the squared norm under nominal conditions would be a chi-square distributed random variable, where for larger residual norms and correspondingly larger CDFs, these would be less likely and thus assigned less weight. Now, to validate this framework, we have the following simulated setup with the 3-minute chimera slow channel for 2 epochs. We also evaluate the mean position errors during authentic and spoofing conditions. We looked at 20 case studies in total, doing 10 simulations of each case. So this is with different vehicle trajectories, different grades of IMUs, and different levels of spoofing attacks. But for sake of time, we'll just look at the results from this trajectory and IMU grade. We also compare the performance of our filter with a series of baselines. So here we have the color codings on the left. The first one, the used GPS, is a conventional filter that directly relies on GPS measurements, whereas the don't use GPS filter just relies on the self-contained sensor information between chimera authentications. The switching filter relies on GPS until it detects spoofing using a chi-squared statistic proposed from prior works, and we look at 2 false alarm rate thresholds for this. The Kalman gain scaling filter is a heuristic filter, which uses the confidence level from the chi-squared statistic to weigh the influence of the GPS measurements, and it does this through the Kalman gain matrix. And the adaptive measurement covariance filter adaptively estimates the covariance matrix of the GPS measurements, and it does this using the residuals in the filter. And finally, for our proposed spoofing resilient filter, we tested this with the Hampel estimation weight function. So going into the results, so here we have the mean position errors across time and across multiple rollouts. And in particular, the y-axis shows the errors during spoofing, and the x-axis and the y-axis shows the error under authentic conditions. The different markers correspond to different attack levels, and we're more interested in looking at the spread of these markers rather than a particular marker location, since this indicates the range of errors that we would see under different attacks. And we first see that as expected, the used GPS filter performs very well under authentications with low error in the y-axis, but it can accumulate a significant amount of error during an experienced attack. And at the same time, the don't use GPS filter, while it's more resilient, it has much higher errors, even when GPS is authentic. We see improved resilience from the adaptive measurement covariance estimation filter, and even better mitigation from the switching filters. But with the larger false alarm rate, those occasional false alarms lead to larger errors under authentic conditions. But the lowest mean errors during spoofing were observed from the proposed spoofing resilient filter. And in particular, if we zoom in to this region here, if we compare each attack level between the proposed spoofing resilient filter and the Kalman gain scaling filter, we see that in each case, the proposed filter has strictly better accuracy during spoofing conditions while maintaining comparable accuracies when GPS is authentic. Okay, so now we've covered the work on ensuring navigation security with Chimera. Before going into the third and last part of today's talk on how we redesign the GPS codes in the memory code space, I'll first give a bit of background on the GPS codes. So previously, we talked about how the GPS satellite sends its information, which the receiver processes and then gets the time of signal reception. But let's go a little bit deeper at what happens on the signal level. So in fact, the GPS satellite signals are overlaid with binary sequences or codes. And these codes are unique to each satellite, and they're known to the receiver beforehand. Now, because all of the satellites are broadcasting the same time, the receiver actually sees an additive superposition of these signals. So in order to process the information from a particular satellite, let's say satellite 1, the receiver correlates the incoming signal with a replica of that satellite signal based on its unique code. And then if we look at the correlation with respect to the signal of interest, because these codes match, we would see a distinct peak with respect to the base correlation level. And then the receiver can track this signal peak to extract that satellite signal and process it further. On the other hand, if we compare with respect to the other satellite, let's say the correlation with respect to satellite 2, because these codes are different, we would see minimal correlations with respect to that satellite. And that's what we want, since these correlations just correspond to noise or interference when we're trying to process satellite 1's signal. So when designing the GPS codes, we have two key criteria that we're interested in. For any satellite signal, we want the correlation with respect to itself, its autocorrelation, to give us a distinct peak. And the relative height of this peak with respect to the base correlation level corresponds to the amount of noise that we can tolerate in the received signal. So we want low autocorrelation side lobes for this purpose. Additionally, we want little correlation with respect to the other satellites, or low cross-correlation side lobes, for reduced interference when processing any particular satellite signal. So now, while the current GPS codes are designed to have pretty good auto and cross-correlation properties, now that the future signals are reprogrammable, can we achieve better performance within the greater space of memory codes? And in particular, how do we design the memory codes for this purpose? That's what we'll look into here. So for the greater memory code design space, we use this three-part stochastic optimization framework, and I'll go over the high-level framework before presenting the details of each part. So starting with the code generator, this models a proposal distribution over the design space from which we sample code families. And the actual memory code space is discrete and very highly dimensional, but here we illustrate in a 2D space for ease of visualization. Then we evaluate each of these sampled points with respect to our objective function. And from these evaluated samples, we can then determine how to improve the distribution parameters in order to reduce the overall objective. And if we repeat this process, we should see that our proposal distribution will shift towards lower objective regions of the design space. Now, going into a bit more detail on the code generator, for the proposal distribution over the space of memory codes, we represent the proposal as an independent multivariate Bernoulli distribution. So we have one parameter per bit in the code family, and this represents the probability that bit is sampled as a 1. And so then we can directly sample from this in order to get the set of codes within the family. And for our evaluator, we wanted low autocorrelation and cross-correlation side lobes. So we used the mean squared side lobe level and framed the objective as the maximum between these two. in order to ensure that we minimize both simultaneously. And for our optimizer, we estimate the gradient of the expected objective with respect to our proposal distribution parameters theta. And this is done using the natural evolution strategy, which evaluates it as a mean over the sample set. And this is in terms of each sample's objective, as well as the gradient of its log probability with respect to the current proposal distribution. And then from this gradient estimate, we can then improve the proposal parameters using any first order optimizer, such as gradient descent or ATOM, which is what we use in this framework. And in addition to this, we also incorporate a constant baseline, which is the mean performance of the sample set. And this is incorporated as a subtraction when estimating the gradient. Now, incorporating a constant baseline doesn't introduce any bias in the gradient estimate, but it can significantly reduce its variance, thereby improving the overall optimization performance. And we can actually observe this. So for these example scenarios, we have the optimization performance without the baseline in green, and then the performance over time for our framework. And we can see that the incorporation of the baseline leads to faster and more consistent optimization with time. And for the final results of the algorithm, here we have the converged results for different lengths of codes. And notice that the 1023 length is actually the length of the current GPS L1CA codes being broadcast today. We also plot the performance of the best gold and wheel code families from 10,000 randomly sampled sets of these codes. And we plot the performance for our method for different code family sizes as well, from a family size of 3 up to a family size of 31 codes. And 31 is also the number of operational GPS satellites today. And indeed, we can see that for all tested code lengths, our method outperforms the best gold and wheel codes for all family sizes. So to summarize, in this dissertation, we derived continuous spoofing detector and state estimator for between chimera authentications, which accounts for the unmodeled sensing biases. We also proposed the first spoofing resilient filter for chimera GPS, which leverages the unauthenticated GPS measurements when they're determined to be trustworthy. And finally, we designed a new framework to devise memory codes for GPS, which have better mean squared correlations than the codes used today. And correspondingly, these were the set of related publications during my PhD work with respect to both of these thesis objectives. And there are several aspects of interesting future directions, and I can't enumerate all of them here, but I just put some interesting ones here. So the continuous spoofing detection and state estimation can also be used for secure timing with Chimera using conservative models of the clock bias and drift errors over time. And for secure navigation with regards to the upcoming autonomous vehicle industry, we can integrate our attack resilient filter framework within a collaborative vehicle network. And this would allow for a better evaluation of the trustworthiness of the GPS measurements, as well as cooperative state estimation in the case that authentic GPS isn't available. For the GPS codes, we can interweave local search strategies in order to avoid premature convergence and refine the final code performance. And we recently submitted an abstract related to this, which was accepted for conference proceedings. We could also use the code design framework for applications outside of GPS. So for the future LEO PNT signals, which are currently expanding, and the future lunar satellite navigation signals, which NASA is interested in developing. And thanks to all of you guys for attending my defense. I hope I've made it worth your while. I hope you found some of this work interesting. Yeah, thanks so much for coming, and please let me know if I can answer any questions.
All right, we can now take public comment or questions.
First off, thanks for the fascinating, absolutely fascinating talk. I wanted to ask a little bit about what needs to happen on the receiver side if we start using these reprogrammable satellites.
Right.
Are we imagining a world where there needs to be firmware updates every year to every GPS receiver because there's new codes? Or is the idea that you could have backward compatibility? And I'd just love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So definitely if receivers were also reprogrammable, that would really help speed up any updates that we do. We can quickly update satellites and receivers correspondingly. Yeah, currently that's less of the case. It's harder to update from the receiver side. They're kind of, I mean, just because currently the signals have also been fixed. But yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think ideally we would have a world where the manufacturers are also just as adaptable as the future GPS satellites. Yeah, thank you. And then with that, if you update the codes, then you can download them directly, at least with the Chimera signal as well. For the public key has to be downloaded occasionally if that's implemented in future GPS. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
Right.
Why would I want?
Oh, for sure. Oh, can you repeat for the Zoom?
Oh yeah. Why would I want to spoof a GPS signal? I guess like what kind of like antagonistic actors are you trying to prevent with like this kind of authentication?
Yeah, definitely. So there's actually a lot of different, very different motivators, I guess, for that. So definitely, yeah. So first of all, critical infrastructure relies on GPS. So for example, the power grid, the future smart grid will rely more and more on GPS for precise timing. So that's one aspect of just a terrorist attack, just to attack our critical infrastructure. Another aspect, I'll just name another aspect as a reference. So there's a lot of self-spoofing that happens actually. That's maybe one you haven't thought of before, but basically people who want to fish in waters that are like, they're not allowed to, they might self-spoof so that their trackers aren't recognizing that they're going into those waters. That's one common case. Or also sometimes people, outside of spoofing, people will just jam their signal so that like a truck, there's been cases of truck drivers jamming their own GPS signal so that their employee doesn't know that they ventured off their truck driving course. And that's another different case. But it can also just, if you just want to create havoc for like transportation as well. Yeah, good question. Oh.
Sorry, it's a quick follow-up. Do these methods help with this, with the jamming? I know that you've talked a lot about spoofing, but I wasn't sure how they'd affect jamming.
Right, that's a good question. Yeah, so jamming is less of an issue for detection since it just makes your GPS unavailable. So in that case, for jamming, it's I think that there's a limitation to how much we can handle because the GPS signals are weak. So if the jammer is just overpowering those signals, then there's a limitation to how much additional processing can help with that. But thankfully, there's multiple frequencies of GPS signals. So hopefully, unless you're being jammed in all of those, you might have GPS availability from a different frequency. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
With Chimera, we'll introduce stochastic perturbations to the codes, right? So
Yes.
offhand,
Yeah.
how would you use your framework to optimize for a code that's going to be perturbed by a specific percentage stochastically?
Right. That's a really good question. So you're saying like you might optimize the GPS codes, but then of course, some of them will be perturbed because of those embedded watermarks from Chimera, right? Yeah, I think that was actually one aspect we were kind of considering, like, should we design codes that are kind of robust to these perturbations from Chimera? Yeah, I think that would actually be a really interesting thing, just to see like how much you can purposefully design for that to improve correlation properties despite that uncertainty. I'm not exactly sure offhand, but given that it's such a small percentage, it's possible you can't optimize for it too much, but also maybe like that's an aspect of code design, just this robust aspect of code design that would be interesting to consider, definitely. Yeah, thank you.
To what degree does like can like spoofing GPS signals like throw off like one's accuracy? And I ask this mainly because like if there are GPS signals coming in that like significantly like deviate your like current position, would those signals already be caught by other systems, like perhaps for preventing like GPS signals coming through because of like reflections from like taller buildings or something like that? Are there other systems that would like catch like larger offsets if the
Right.
GPS is spoofed?
Right, you're saying, so I just want to make sure, yeah, so you're saying that like if you get other errors in your GPS signal, let's say from tall buildings, can we detect that separately? Is that the
Yeah.
question? Yeah, definitely. And definitely that's actually one aspect. So we were looking at the case, so you have a smart spoofer that's going to be self-consistent, right? So under nominal conditions, like your GPS measurements are agreeing, but you want to check that they are actually valid. But in this case, what if you're in like an urban environment where you have tall buildings? Well, yeah, that's actually an aspect of future work that we're interested in. So in that case, we would want, I think what would make sense is having an initial detector that first checks how consistent your measurements are. And then, and actually a lot of frameworks will do this beforehand. They'll just check using something called RAIN. And then from those consistent measurements, then kind of validate that they match with your self-contained sensor information. Yeah.
So my question would be like, if there are like measurements that are like, significantly deviated because of like, urban environments or like other conditions,
Right.
Would some of those spoof signals also just be caught by those means as well? Because like
Right.
the deviations would be significant enough.
Right. Yeah, good question. Yeah. So if the spoofer only does like spoofs, let's say a few of the satellites, it's possible that those would be inconsistent with, so because these a lot of these fault detection algorithms look at the consistency of the received measurements. Are we getting these really large residuals from what we would expect? But if the spoofer is smart and does all of the satellites in view, then they can design it so they're all consistent with respect to your state estimate.
I see. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
I think this will probably be our last question, then we'll close the open session.
I think the word was zonotope. Is that the right word?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
How does using zonotopes compare with performance and computational efficiency with the particle filter?
Oh, interesting question. Yeah. So actually, zonotopes are very computationally efficient. So when we do operations with probabilistic zonotopes, it's just matrix concatenations and summations to do these like filtering operations with them. And with respect to particle filters, and that makes sense too, right? Because it's also a tool that's commonly used for robotics as well. And with respect to particle filters too, those would scale with the number of particles you have. And then the number of particles you need also scales with the number of dimensions you're trying to estimate in. So I think that those would be much more efficient in that respect. Yeah, like interesting point. I never thought about using particle filtering for this framework. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Let's go ahead and thank Tara once more. All right, well, thank you very much. We're gonna take a short break and then we'll have the closed exam portion.